Welcome to Workplace Psychology with Dr. Martha Grajdek. I'm Dr. Martha Grajdek. This podcast examines a wide variety of work-related issues through the lens of industrial and organizational psychology. And while many of the topics discussed here may be seen as intended for white-collar employees and their employers, in reality, the ideas presented here are applicable across organizations and industries. Additionally, many of the topics discussed here may be applicable outside of the workplace. I encourage you to examine what's presented here, apply what makes sense to you, and simply discard the rest. When employees face the pressure of behaving or performing in ways that go against their own values, doing so may come at a high price. In this episode, I want to talk to you about ethical dilemmas, ethical stress, and the moral injury that can follow. Whenever employees are expected to behave or perform tasks, or are asked to or told to behave in ways or perform the kinds of tasks that do not align with their own values, their own morals and ethics, that can cause a tremendous amount of stress on the employee. It's not difficult to understand why such a misalignment could be so stressful. On one hand, an employee faces a certain loyalty, a certain responsibility, not only to the organization and his or her employer, but also to a financial security that they need for themselves and perhaps for a family. On the other hand, every individual has a set of morals and ethics and values which help to guide and dictate their own behaviors, their own choices in life. And that includes what they do and how they behave at work. So when the work expectations are at odds with personal values, the toll that one pays can be quite high. Let's start by defining ethical stress. It's not a difficult concept to understand. Basically, it comes down to the existence of inconsistencies or a misalignment between personal values and the kinds of behaviors that are expected from an employer. Regardless of how much the employer pushes for certain behaviors, the kinds of behaviors that are not aligned with the individual's personal values, whether that's firmly being told this is what you have to do or else, or whether these are mere suggestions or unspoken expectations or unspoken rules. Whatever the employer's approach, chances are that if there is that misalignment, there will be effects on the employee, and these effects will not be good ones. This is what ethical stress is. It can have negative effects on a person's physical health, but also on their psychological and emotional well-being. It can lead to stress and even burnout. It can also lead to what is known as moral injury. Moral injury, again, is pretty self-explanatory. A moral injury, in essence, is an injury to an individual's conscience. It's an injury to a person's sense of values, morals, and ethics. Such an injury can come about as a result from a real or a perceived transgression related directly to the individual or to others around them, others in that environment, in that individual's environment. When people face ethical dilemmas, ethical stress, moral injury, not only can they feel stress and burnout and physical health impairments, they can start to become detached. They can start to become cynical as a result. It's not difficult to understand why ethical dilemmas, ethical stress, and moral injury is bad for employees. It's bad for the organization. It's bad for the whole workplace experience. Before I move on to discussing best practices for both individuals and organizations dealing with ethical dilemmas and the inevitable consequences, it's important to note the value of prevention. If you as an employee, if you as an employer are not experiencing or having others experience ethical dilemmas as part of their workplace experience, your job is to understand what ethical dilemmas are and to recognize any red flags that may suggest that your organization may be heading into the danger zone. Prevention is much easier to deal with than the aftermath, than cleaning up a mess and trying to heal. So remember, just because you have not found evidence of ethical dilemmas in your organization or your personal experience, do not get too comfortable with that. Things can change on a dime. They can truly turn overnight. Focusing on prevention and being prepared is key in avoiding a disaster down the road. The best practices that I'm going to share with you in this episode, whether they're intended for individuals or the organization, are equally as effective for preventative work as they are for dealing with ethical dilemmas and their effects. Individuals will do well to understand their own values. What are your personal values, your morals, your ethics, and how do they compare to what you see around you in your environment, the ethics that you see coming from the organization? It's important to point out that individual values and organizational values don't have to necessarily align 100%, but as long as they are somewhere in the same general area, an individual should be able to work for an employer without feeling ethical stress. It is when certain lines are crossed that problems creep in. So remember, a 100% match of individual values to the values of an organization is not necessarily required. The values of each do not have to be 100% aligned, but they have to be able to coexist without interfering with one another. That brings me to the next idea, especially for individuals. Make sure you understand which are the red lines that you are not willing to cross. And along with those lines, identify what kinds of red flags could alert you to a potential misalignment of ethics between you and your employer. Knowing your own values and understanding where you stand and what lines you're not willing to cross, being able to identify red flags will allow you to keep a preventative approach before things go terribly wrong at work. The organization has the same responsibilities. It has to be able to define its values, but also understand what lines it is not willing to cross and what kinds of red flags should be considered as very important, as warnings. If an organization has no defined values, if it doesn't understand what it is and is not willing to do, then crossing those lines into the danger zone will be that much easier to do, that much more difficult to recognize, and that much more laborious to recover from. The same thing is true for individuals. If you as an individual do not know what your personal values are, what lines you're not willing to cross, or what you consider red flags, it will be much easier for you to slide into that gray area and then potentially into a place where you don't want to be. The organization has an absolute responsibility and, of course, an opportunity as a preventative measure, but also as a way of fixing existing problems, to create and maintain channels, ways, opportunities for people to speak up. Individuals at every level of the organization should have a means of bringing to the organization's attention ethical problems and dilemmas, or potential ethical problems and dilemmas, without any fear of retribution. Non-retaliation must be part of the organizational makeup. Remember that the first time any kind of hint of retaliation, whether it's actual or perceived, makes its way into the workforce, it will be that much more difficult for anyone else to speak up and bring potentially critical information to the organization's attention. The other thing that I want to suggest is that every organization have an ethics department or an ethics office. Such an entity within the organization will not necessarily look the same for every company. What's important is that this ethics department or ethics committee or ethics office have some actual meaning behind it, has some actual power to it, and has some proverbial teeth. It cannot be a department or a committee in a name only, one that does nothing, one that maybe looks good on paper, but is ineffective and powerless. If an organization is serious about working within certain ethical boundaries or parameters, there has to be a guiding entity within that organization that goes beyond mere presence. What do we do in situations where ethics have been breached, where ethical dilemma is a reality at an organization? Clearly, healing and repair work are required at that point. Changes will have to be put into place to make sure that history does not repeat itself within that organization. Healing and repair work can and should include things such as transparency, or rather improved transparency, potentially public apologies from management or leadership. And remember that public apologies can be apologies to the world outside of the organization, or they can be apologies within the organization, or they can be both, of course, whatever is appropriate and required. Sometimes restitution is required as part of healing and repair work. An organization would do well to encourage the formation of peer groups for the purpose of healing and repair work. In some instances, outside third-party representatives may be required. You can see that when it comes to healing and repair, after ethics have been compromised, that an organization is a tall order. It takes a lot of effort and sometimes a lot of time. In certain instances, complete healing may take many years, and the damage to the organization's reputation, be it external reputation or internal reputation, may be tremendous in its magnitude. This is why prevention is so important. Organizations will do well to take a look at the ethics within the company, present and past. Collect information anonymously, if necessary. Allow people a safe channel to voice their concerns and to share information. And review the data and look for patterns on a regular basis. This could be monthly or quarterly. As I mentioned in the beginning, sliding from a relatively ethical environment and a relatively ethical experience into one that can lead to potential disaster can happen very quickly. Keeping an eye on the daily experience and watching for patterns over time is absolutely critical for any organization. As this episode comes to an end, let's review what was discussed. Ethical dilemmas at work are real and often lead to moral injury. When faced with ethical stress, employees find themselves in a place where there's a misalignment between their own values and the values of the organization. This can have many negative effects, from physical health issues to psychological and emotional issues. Becoming disinterested and disconnected from work, feeling stressed out, and reaching a state of burnout are not uncommon in these situations. As with most things in life, prevention is much easier than trying to repair damage. Both individuals and organizations have the responsibility and the opportunity to do preventative work. But remember that this kind of work has to be an ongoing process. Things can happen very quickly, very easily, and unexpectedly, where an otherwise ethical environment becomes one where ethics are truly challenged. Knowing your values and understanding what lines you're not willing to cross, both as an individual and as an organization, are key. Employers have the responsibility of understanding the values and ethics across the company. They also have the responsibility of tracking any patterns over time in order to take the appropriate action as necessary, whether that action means keeping up the good work or preventing things from going astray. As this week unfolds, I encourage you to consider ethical dilemmas at work, whether you're an employee or the employer. What is your experience like? What is your environment like? Do you know and truly understand your own values to the point of being able to identify what lines you would not be willing to cross, or what lines would be detrimental for you to cross? What kind of red flags can you identify, or potential red flags can you identify when you think of ethical dilemmas at work? Take what you've learned from this episode and commit to taking preventative measures in order to potentially avoid ethical issues down the road, prevent them the best that you can, and repair problems if they should occur. For those of you who experience this podcast in an audio-only version, I encourage you to check out my YouTube channel, Stress Free with Dr. G, where you can find the video version of this podcast. Once you're there, check out some of the other videos. They focus on stress management. As I mentioned, Stress Free with Dr. G is found on YouTube. The link for that is in the description below. Thank you for joining me today. Please subscribe to this podcast. I look forward to seeing you here again next time. Until then, I wish you joy and well-being.